Most people believe manipulation is dramatic. They imagine raised voices, obvious deception, clear aggression. But real manipulation is quiet. It hides inside tone, inside timing, inside suggestion, inside silence. It rarely looks malicious. It looks reasonable, and that is why it works. Every day, conversations shape perception before you notice they've shifted direction. Decisions are influenced before logic arrives. Emotions are activated before thought begins. The most powerful manipulation does not control your behavior directly. It controls your interpretation of reality. And once interpretation shifts, choice follows naturally. In this audiobook, we will examine the hidden psychological mechanisms that operate beneath everyday interaction, not to encourage manipulation, but to understand it. Because you cannot defend against what you do not recognize, and you cannot communicate powerfully without understanding the mechanics of influence itself. By the end of this audiobook, you will see conversations differently. You will detect frames. You will notice emotional engineering. You will recognize subtle dominance strategies. And most importantly, you will think more independently. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Invisible Architecture of Influence. Most people believe manipulation is about controlling behavior. It isn't. It's about controlling interpretation. Behavior is downstream. Interpretation is upstream. If you control how someone interprets a situation, you rarely need to control what they do next. Their actions will follow naturally. This is the invisible architecture of influence. It is not loud. It is not forceful. It is rarely obvious. It is structural, and structure determines outcome. Influence begins before the conversation starts. One of the most underestimated aspects of manipulation is that it often begins before a single word is spoken. Consider a workplace meeting. The seating arrangement. Who sits at the head of the table? Who speaks first? Who presents slides? Who frames the agenda? These are not neutral details. They shape perceived authority before arguments are evaluated. If a senior executive opens a discussion with, "Let's explore whether this proposal is financially responsible," notice what just happened. The proposal is now implicitly risky. No evidence has been presented yet, but the emotional lens has been installed. Everyone now evaluates through caution. That is architecture. It is not about what is said. It is about what is established. The power of context control. Human beings rarely evaluate information in isolation. We evaluate information relative to context. If I show you a house valued at $500,000, you react differently depending on what you saw before it. If you just saw a $2 million property, $500,000 feels affordable. If you just saw a $200,000 property, $500,000 feels excessive. The house didn't change. The context did. This is called anchoring. But in daily life, it feels natural. Sales environments use this constantly. A premium option is shown first, then a slightly lower option. The second option now feels reasonable. This is not accidental. It is designed perception. Manipulation rarely invents reality. It arranges it. The first frame often wins. In negotiation psychology, there is a principle that appears repeatedly. The first strong frame introduced into a conversation is disproportionately powerful. Why? Because the brain prefers cognitive efficiency. Once a narrative is accepted, it resists replacing it. If a colleague says, "This is going to be a difficult quarter," and you respond, "It might be challenging, but we have strong positioning." Notice the difference. The first frame introduced difficulty. The second attempted to soften it. But difficulty is now embedded in the mental model. Even if optimism is added later, it competes with the original lens. Strategic individuals understand this. They do not wait to respond to frames. They introduce their own. Instead of reacting to, "This is risky," they might say, "This is a calculated growth move." Same situation, different architecture. Emotional temperature as a hidden lever. Conversations have emotional temperature. High, low, tense, relaxed, urgent, calm. Manipulation often works by shifting temperature before shifting logic. Imagine someone begins a discussion with, "I don't want to make this dramatic." Immediately, drama is implied. Or someone says, "I am just being honest." Honesty is framed as potentially uncomfortable. These micro signals prepare emotional reaction. By the time facts are introduced, Your nervous system has already adjusted. Emotional priming reduces resistance. If you are slightly anxious, you make faster decisions. If you are slightly flattered, you become more agreeable. If you feel scarcity, you compress evaluation time. The manipulator doesn't force choice, they engineer state. Subtle authority signals. Influence is magnified by perceived authority, but authority is often signaled through small cues: tone stability, pace of speech, confidence in phrasing, minimal hesitation, direct eye contact. A person who speaks slowly and calmly appears more certain than someone who speaks quickly and nervously, even if the content is identical. Consider two statements: "I think this might work," versus "this will work." The second removes doubt. Certainty influences belief, even without evidence. In meetings, individuals who project certainty are often assumed competent, not because of data, but because of delivery. This is why emotional control is a power multiplier. When you remain calm under pressure, you signal dominance without aggression. Manipulators sometimes simulate calm to increase persuasion. Strategic individuals cultivate genuine composure to increase clarity. Social proof as invisible pressure. Humans are deeply influenced by perceived consensus. If someone says, "Everyone agrees this is the right move," you feel subtle pressure to align, even if everyone is undefined. Social proof reduces cognitive effort. If others approve, the decision feels safer. This mechanism is used constantly in marketing, media, and leadership communication. Consider phrases like, "Most people choose this option. This is our most popular plan." Top performers adopt this method. You are not being ordered, you are being aligned. Subtle difference, but psychologically powerful. The danger of unquestioned frames. The real power of manipulation lies in unnoticed framing. When you fail to recognize the lens, you argue inside it. For example, if someone frames a conversation as, "Why are you always so defensive?" and you respond by explaining why you aren't defensive, you've already accepted the premise. You are now defending against a label. A stronger response would question the frame itself. What makes you interpret this as defensiveness? Now the frame is examined. Strategic awareness shifts focus from content to structure. What is being assumed? What is being implied? What lens has been installed? Once you detect framing, you regain agency. Real-world scenario: workplace manipulation. Imagine a team leader says, "I need people who are fully committed." This sounds neutral, but the implication is disagreement equals lack of commitment. If someone questions a strategy, they risk being seen as uncommitted. The frame discourages dissent. The architecture protects authority. This is not always malicious. Sometimes leaders do this unconsciously, but the effect remains. Recognizing this allows you to respond strategically. "I am fully committed. That's why I want to examine the risks carefully." You reclaim the frame. Real-world scenario. Relationship dynamics. In personal relationships, manipulation often appears through emotional framing. "I guess I just care more than you do." Now the frame is set. You care less. Any attempt to disagree risks confirming emotional distance. The strategic response is not defensive explanation. It is structural reframing. Caring doesn't mean agreeing with every decision. Again, structure over emotion. Manipulation versus influence. It is important to separate manipulation from influence. Influence becomes manipulation when the frame is hidden intentionally. The emotional state is engineered deceptively. The goal is control rather than clarity. The other party is denied informed choice. Influence itself is neutral. It is embedded in communication. The difference lies in transparency and intent. Understanding influence does not corrupt character. It sharpens perception. Why awareness changes everything. Once you understand invisible architecture, you start noticing it everywhere. Political speeches, corporate messaging, advertising, negotiation, friendships, family conversations. You begin seeing structure beneath content. You pause before reacting. You evaluate frames before accepting them. And that pause is power. Because manipulation thrives in automatic responses, it weakens under scrutiny. Chapter 2. Framing reality before it forms. Most people believe they evaluate reality objectively. They do not. They evaluate reality through frames. A frame is a psychological lens installed before conscious reasoning begins. It determines what something means before you decide whether you agree with it. This is one of the most powerful manipulation tactics in existence, because once a frame is accepted, logic works inside it, and very few people question the frame itself. What is a frame? A frame answers the question, what is this situation? Before the brain decides what to do, it must first categorize what it is dealing with. Is this a threat, an opportunity, a loss, a gain, a risk, a privilege? The label determines the emotional response. The emotional response determines the decision. The manipulator understands this sequence. They do not argue over facts. They define context. Example, the same situation, different frame. Imagine a company restructuring. Frame A, we're cutting costs because performance has been weak. Frame B, we're reallocating resources to strengthen our competitive position. The action is identical. The frame changes emotional interpretation. Frame A triggers insecurity. Frame B triggers strategic thinking. People inside frame B are less resistant. This is why framing is not about lying. It is about emphasis. What is highlighted? What is minimized? What is implied? The power of problem framing. When someone frames a situation as a problem, you react defensively. When someone frames it as a challenge, you react strategically. When someone frames it as an opportunity, you react optimistically. Language installs frame instantly. Consider, we have a serious issue, versus, we have an adjustment to make. Issue feels heavy, adjustment feels manageable. In negotiations, whoever frames the discussion first gains advantage. If I begin with, this is going to be complicated, you are now mentally braced for difficulty. If I begin with, this is straightforward, your brain prepares for simplicity. Expectation shapes perception. Perception shapes behavior. Frame control in conversations. Framing is used constantly in everyday dialogue. Example, you are being emotional. Now the frame is emotional instability. If you respond with emotional intensity, you confirm it. If you respond defensively, you confirm it. The trap is not the statement. The trap is the frame. The stronger response is structural. What makes you interpret this as emotional? Now the frame is being examined. This is advanced psychological awareness. Most people argue within frames. Strategic individuals question frames. Political and media framing. You see this everywhere. A protest can be framed as a fight for justice or a threat to stability. A tax policy can be framed as relief for families or a burden on businesses. The policy may be identical. The public reaction changes based on framing. This is why media language is rarely neutral. Words are chosen carefully, because interpretation precedes evaluation. The emotional anchor effect. Frames often include emotional anchors. Consider these phrases: common sense reform, radical change, fair contribution, unnecessary burden. These words preload emotional judgment. Before data appears, emotion has already been activated. Once emotion is activated, rational evaluation becomes selective. You look for confirmation, you ignore contradiction, not consciously, automatically. Why framing is so effective? Because the brain seeks efficiency. When a frame is introduced, the mind stops searching for alternative interpretations. It conserves energy. Cognitive ease feels correct. This is why reframing is uncomfortable. It forces mental recalibration. It requires effort. Most people resist it. Subtle framing in relationships. In personal dynamics, framing shapes power balance. Example, I guess I just expect more effort. Now the frame implies lack of effort. Any defense risks reinforcing the accusation. The strategic response avoids direct defense. Instead, what does effort look like to you? Now the frame is clarified. When you clarify frames, you prevent emotional manipulation from solidifying. Framing through questions. Questions can frame as effectively as statements. Why are you so quiet today? Now quietness is framed as abnormal. Why didn't you try harder? Now effort is framed as insufficient. Even innocent questions can shape perception. This is not always malicious, but the effect remains. When someone frames through a question, you must examine the assumption embedded inside it. Advanced frame control. Strategic individuals install frames intentionally. Instead of defending against, this seems risky, they might say, it's calculated expansion. Notice the shift. Risk implies danger. Expansion implies growth. The underlying facts remain. But emotional interpretation shifts. This is not deception, it is psychological positioning. The most dangerous frames are identity frames. You are the responsible one. You are the emotional one. You are the aggressive type. You are the quiet one. Once identity is framed, behavior adapts to it. People unconsciously conform to assigned labels. If someone frames you as unreliable, you must consciously reject it, because identity frames, if accepted, become self-fulfilling. How to defend against framing? 1. Slow down emotional reaction. 2. Identify the assumption inside the statement. 3. Ask yourself, is this objectively true or just structured that way? 4. Reframe consciously. Example, instead of accepting, this deadline is impossible, reframe, it's tight, but manageable with prioritization. You regain psychological ground. The strategic lesson. Manipulation through framing is powerful because it feels natural. It rarely sounds aggressive. It sounds logical, but logic inside a distorted frame leads to distorted conclusions. Once you begin spotting frames, you regain clarity. You no longer react automatically. You evaluate structure before content, and structure is where power lives. Chapter 3. Emotional engineering. How feelings are activated before decisions are made. Most people believe they make decisions logically. They don't. They justify decisions logically. They make them emotionally. Emotion is faster than reasoning. It is older than reasoning. It is more influential than reasoning. And manipulation understands this perfectly. If someone can shift your emotional state, they do not need to overpower your logic, because your logic will adjust to your state. The sequence of control. Every decision follows a predictable internal order. 1. Emotional state is activated. 2. Interpretation aligns with that emotion. 3. Reasoning supports the interpretation. 4. Behavior follows. Manipulators target step 1. They rarely argue with step 3. Subtle emotional priming. Emotional priming does not look dramatic. It looks casual. A compliment before a request. A story before a proposal. A problem reminder before a solution. Imagine someone saying, "You've always been someone who steps up when things matter." Now they make a request. You feel pride. Pride increases compliance. You don't want to contradict the identity that was just installed. This is not force. It is emotional alignment. Fear as a lever. Fear is one of the oldest psychological triggers. It narrows focus. It accelerates decision-making. It reduces skepticism. Consider marketing language. If you don't act now, you might miss out. Failure to prepare could cost you. Most people regret not starting sooner. Fear compresses time. When the nervous system is activated, the brain prioritizes safety over analysis. In workplaces, fear framing often sounds like, "We can't afford to make mistakes here." Mistakes become catastrophic. Caution becomes anxiety. Anxious people conform more easily, not because they lack intelligence, but because fear reduces cognitive bandwidth. Flattery and ego activation. Ego is another powerful emotional lever. Flattery lowers resistance. When someone says, "You are one of the few people I trust with this," you feel elevated. Elevation increases compliance. You want to maintain that identity. This is often used in professional environments. You are the only one who can handle this. Now refusal feels like failure. The manipulation is not in the request. It is in the emotional setup. Guilt as silent pressure. Guilt is one of the most effective compliance tools. Not loud guilt, subtle guilt. "I thought you'd understand. I guess I was wrong about you. I just expected more." These statements activate social belonging instincts. Humans are wired to avoid social rejection. Guilt feels like social risk, and most people resolve it by conceding. But guilt-based manipulation is powerful precisely because it feels moral. You don't feel pressured, you feel responsible. That distinction matters. Excitement and future projection. Manipulation is not always negative emotion. Excitement is equally powerful. When someone paints an ambitious future, imagine where you'll be in 6 months. Think about how different your life could look. Your brain begins simulating reward. Reward anticipation reduces risk sensitivity. This is why high-pressure sales environments use visualization. They activate desire before cost. Once desire is emotionally installed, objections weaken. Emotional contagion. Emotion spreads socially. If someone enters a room calm, the room stabilizes. If someone enters anxious, the room tightens. Skilled influencers regulate their emotional projection deliberately. A calm tone under pressure signals control. A confident pause signals certainty. Emotional contagion is rarely noticed consciously, but it shapes perception deeply. People often trust how you feel more than what you say. Emotional overload. Another tactic is emotional flooding. Overwhelm reduces critical thinking. When too much information, urgency, or emotional intensity is introduced at once, the brain seeks relief. Relief often comes through compliance. Imagine a negotiation where the other party speaks rapidly, introduces multiple arguments, references past examples, raises concerns, and pushes for immediate response. This creates cognitive fatigue. Fatigued people concede, not because they agree, because they want the pressure to stop. The strategic counter. Emotional engineering only works when you react unconsciously. Defense begins with awareness of your internal state. Ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Why? Did this emotion arise naturally? Or was it triggered before a request? If you feel urgency, pause. If you feel flattered, pause. If you feel guilty, pause. Time restores rational balance. Manipulation thrives in emotional momentum. Clarity thrives in delay. Real-world scenario. Workplace. A manager says, "This is a critical moment for the company. We need people who are truly committed." Now fear and loyalty are activated. If you hesitate, you appear disloyal, but the statement itself engineered the emotion. Recognizing that removes its power, you can respond calmly. "I am committed to doing what's strategically sound." You shift from emotional loyalty to rational evaluation. Real-world scenario. Relationships. "I guess I just care more about this than you do." Guilt, belonging threat, social rejection, fear. The untrained mind reacts defensively. The trained mind recognizes the emotional setup and responds with composure. Caring isn't measured by agreeing, emotion neutralized. Why emotional control equals power. The person who controls their emotional state controls the pace of interaction. They cannot be rushed easily. They cannot be guilted easily. They cannot be flattered easily. They respond from awareness, not impulse. This is why emotional detachment is often misunderstood. It is not about being cold. It is about maintaining clarity under emotional influence. Manipulation loses strength when you do not mirror the emotional state being projected. The core insight. Framing installs interpretation. Emotion installs motivation. Once both are aligned, behavior follows naturally. That is the architecture. You do not need to force someone. You shape how they feel. You shape how they interpret. They move themselves. Understanding this does not make you manipulative. It makes you aware, and awareness restores agency. In the next chapter, we go deeper into status psychology, how hierarchy signals amplify manipulation without a single word being spoken. Chapter 4. The subtle art of status manipulation. Before people evaluate what you say, they evaluate who you are. Or more accurately, they evaluate where you rank. Human beings are deeply sensitive to hierarchy. We constantly and unconsciously assess who has more authority, who has more social proof, who appears more confident, who appears more composed, who appears more valuable. This happens in seconds, not minutes. And once hierarchy is assigned, it shapes the rest of the interaction. Status precedes logic. Two people can say the exact same sentence. One is believed, one is questioned. Why? Status. Imagine a junior employee presenting a bold idea. Now imagine a senior executive presenting the same idea. The content is identical. The response is not, because hierarchy influences credibility. This is not rational. It is psychological. The brain conserves energy by trusting perceived authority. Manipulators understand this deeply. They do not always change arguments. They adjust perceived status, signals that elevate status. Status is often communicated without words. Tone stability, pace of speech, direct eye contact, calm posture, minimal fidgeting, controlled breathing, decisive phrasing. Consider this difference. "I am not sure, but maybe this could work," versus "this works." Certainty creates perceived authority, even when evidence is thin. The brain associates confidence with competence. This bias is powerful and dangerous when misused. Artificial authority construction. Some individuals inflate status deliberately. Titles, certifications, associations, name dropping, luxury cues, environment control. If someone mentions, "I've worked with industry leaders," without specifics, status is implied. If someone conducts a meeting standing while others sit, hierarchy is reinforced. If someone references exclusive access, perceived value increases. These are subtle tactics, not always malicious, but powerful. Status and compliance. Research in behavioral psychology consistently shows people comply more readily with perceived authority, even when the authority is symbolic. Uniforms increase obedience. Formal settings increase compliance. Structured environments reduce dissent. Why? Because hierarchy simplifies decision-making. If someone higher in the structure approves, it feels safe to follow. Manipulation amplifies this instinct. Social dominance through calm. One of the most powerful status signals is calmness under pressure. When tension rises, most people escalate emotionally. The individual who remains composed appears dominant. Silence under scrutiny. Slow responses under challenge. Measured tone under disagreement. This communicates, "I am not threatened." And in hierarchy psychology, the unthreatened individual appears higher. Manipulators sometimes simulate calm strategically. Strategic individuals cultivate it authentically. The difference lies in intent. Micro behaviors that shift hierarchy. Small actions alter status dynamics. Interrupting. Speaking last. Speaking first. Holding eye contact slightly longer. Leaning back instead of forward. Taking time before answering. For example, when someone challenges you and you respond instantly, you appear reactive. When someone challenges you and you pause before answering, you appear deliberate. Deliberation signals control. Control signals status. The danger of status acceptance. One of the most overlooked manipulation tactics is subtle status lowering. "You wouldn't understand. This might be too complex. You are overthinking it." These statements reduce perceived competence. If accepted internally, confidence decreases, and lowered internal status affects external behavior. You speak less confidently, you hesitate, you concede faster. Manipulation often begins by shrinking perceived authority. Once someone doubts their position, influence becomes easier. Real-world scenario: workplace. A senior colleague says, "I've been doing this for 20 years. Now hierarchy is introduced." The implication: experience equals correctness. The inexperienced individual may withdraw, even if their idea is stronger. The strategic response is not confrontation, it is repositioning. Experience is valuable. Let's examine the data as well. You respect hierarchy without surrendering reasoning. Real-world scenario: social setting. In group conversations, certain individuals dominate by pacing. They speak slower. They interrupt selectively. They summarize conversations. Summarizing is a powerful dominance behavior. When someone says, "So what we're really saying is," they claim interpretive authority. They frame consensus. Most people do not notice this, but it subtly elevates their position. Status inflation in media and marketing. Expert testimonials, professional backgrounds, formal attire, studio environments, all elevate perceived credibility. The same advice delivered in casual clothing in a bedroom feels different than advice delivered in a formal studio setting. Environment influences status perception, and status influences trust, the psychological core. Why does status manipulation work? Because humans evolved in hierarchical groups. Following high-status individuals increased survival probability. We still carry that wiring. The brain associates hierarchy with safety and competence. This happens unconsciously, which makes it powerful. Defense against status manipulation. 1. Separate content from delivery. 2. Evaluate evidence independently. 3. Notice emotional intimidation. 4. Maintain composure deliberately. When someone projects authority, pause internally. Ask, is this authority earned or projected? Is this certainty backed by evidence or performance? Clarity restores balance. The strategic insight. Status multiplies influence. The same tactic delivered from higher perceived hierarchy has greater effect. This is why emotional control and calm composure are foundational to power, because visible stability signals rank, and rank shapes compliance. Understanding status dynamics does not make you manipulative. It makes you resistant to unconscious submission, and capable of communicating from stability rather than insecurity. Chapter 6. Scarcity, Urgency, and Cognitive Compression. The human brain reacts differently when time feels abundant versus when it feels limited. Abundance allows reflection. Scarcity forces decision. Manipulators understand this deeply. They do not always change the value of an offer. They change the perceived availability of it. Because scarcity activates survival psychology. Why scarcity is so powerful? In evolutionary terms, scarcity signaled threat. Limited food, limited shelter, limited opportunity. Delay could mean loss. So the brain developed a bias: act quickly when resources appear limited. This bias still operates. When something is presented as rare, its perceived value increases, not because it is objectively better, but because it feels harder to obtain. Scarcity shifts focus from evaluation to acquisition. The illusion of limited time. Consider common phrases. Offer ends tonight. Last few spots available. Limited edition. Only 3 left. Even if you were previously undecided, urgency changes the emotional landscape. The internal dialogue shifts from, "Is this the right choice?" to, "If I don't act now, I might lose it." Fear of loss overrides careful reasoning. This is called loss aversion. Humans fear losing opportunities more than they value gaining them. Manipulation leverages that imbalance. Cognitive compression. When urgency is introduced, the brain compresses evaluation time. Long-term consequences fade. Immediate consequences dominate. Under time pressure, risk assessment declines. Detail analysis weakens. Emotional response intensifies. You make faster decisions, not necessarily better ones. Workplace scarcity pressure. In professional environments, urgency is often framed strategically. This needs to be decided today. We don't have time to debate. We must act immediately. Sometimes this is true. Often it is not. But once urgency is installed, opposition feels obstructive. If you request more time, you appear indecisive. Scarcity creates compliance through social pressure. The fastest response appears most aligned. Relationship-based urgency. Scarcity is not limited to business. It appears in personal dynamics too. If this matters to you, you'll decide now. I can't wait forever. This might be your last chance. Now the relationship itself becomes scarce. Scarcity activates fear of abandonment. Fear reduces negotiation. Compliance increases. Artificial scarcity. Many environments manufacture scarcity deliberately. Online countdown timers, exclusive memberships, limited access invitations. These tactics create perceived privilege. Privilege increases perceived value, even when access could be expanded easily. Scarcity signals importance, but importance is not always intrinsic. Sometimes it is engineered. Scarcity and status. Scarcity also affects perceived hierarchy. If someone appears busy, unavailable, hard to access, their status increases. This is why strategic silence and delayed response can elevate perceived value. Over availability lowers perceived scarcity. Scarcity increases perceived demand. Perceived demand increases perceived worth. Emotional reaction to scarcity. Scarcity activates 3 primary emotions: anxiety, excitement, competition. Anxiety drives urgency. Excitement drives impulsivity. Competition drives commitment. When you believe others want what you want, you desire it more intensely, even if you were indifferent before. This is the psychology behind auction dynamics. Bidding increases emotional investment. Investment increases commitment. Commitment overrides rational valuation. The danger of rushed decisions. Most regret follows rushed choice. Because urgency narrows perspective, you stop asking, "Is this aligned with my long-term interest?" Instead you ask, "Will I lose this opportunity?" Manipulation rarely forces agreement, it accelerates it, and acceleration reduces scrutiny. Defense against scarcity manipulation. When urgency appears, do not react immediately. Create artificial distance. Ask, "Is this genuinely time-sensitive or strategically presented that way?" If something is truly valuable, it will withstand evaluation. If it disappears under scrutiny, it was never stable. Delay restores clarity. Time expands reasoning. Manipulation loses power in extended time frames. Real-world scenario, sales environment. A salesperson says, "This is the final unit available." Your heart rate increases slightly. You imagine missing out. You picture someone else acquiring it. Your internal narrative shifts from analysis to acquisition. But what if you responded calmly? I'll consider it and return tomorrow. If it's truly the final unit, it may not be there. But if it's not, the illusion dissolves. Either way, you regain control. Scarcity as internal strategy. Interestingly, scarcity is not only used to influence others, it is also used strategically by disciplined individuals. Limited availability of your time, limited emotional access, limited reactive engagement. When you control your own scarcity, you increase perceived value. But this must be authentic. Artificial withdrawal can feel manipulative. Genuine prioritization communicates self-respect. The strategic insight. Scarcity manipulates through compression. It narrows your thinking. It shortens your evaluation window. It elevates fear of loss. The strongest defense is calm delay. When time pressure rises, your response should slow. That reversal restores power. Next, we examine how small commitments escalate into larger compliance. The psychology of incremental control. Chapter 7. Incremental commitment and identity hijacking. Manipulation rarely begins with a major request. It begins with a minor agreement, a small yes. Because once someone says yes once, their internal psychology begins to shift. And that shift is subtle, but powerful. The psychology of consistency. Human beings are wired to prefer consistency. We want our behavior to align with our identity. If you agree to something small, your brain begins updating your self-perception. I am someone who supports this. I am someone who helps. I am someone who agrees. Now, when a slightly larger request appears, it feels natural to remain consistent. This is called commitment escalation. But at a deeper level, it is identity adjustment. And identity is more powerful than logic. The foot in the door mechanism. Imagine someone asks, "Can you review this short document?" It takes 5 minutes. You agree. Later they ask, "Can you help present this idea?" Now you feel involved. Then, "Can you lead this initiative?" The escalation feels gradual. Each step seems reasonable. But the distance between the first agreement and the final responsibility is significant. The manipulator never demanded the final commitment up front. They built momentum. Why small agreements matter. The brain seeks coherence. If you say yes once, refusing later feels like contradiction. Contradiction creates discomfort. To avoid discomfort, you continue agreeing. Even if the later requests are larger than you would have initially accepted. The first yes lowers resistance to the second. The second lowers resistance to the third. Momentum builds quietly. Identity hijacking. The deeper layer is identity hijacking. When someone says, "You are the kind of person who always steps up," you feel seen, you feel validated. Now when they request something, you don't want to betray that identity. The manipulation is not in the request, it is in the label. Once identity is assigned, behavior adapts to preserve it. If you accept, "I am the responsible one," you will take on more responsibility, even if it overwhelms you. If you accept, "I am the strong one," you may avoid showing vulnerability. Identity frames become behavioral scripts. Real-world scenario. Workplace escalation. A manager says, "Can you just help with this one quick task?" You agree. Next week. You handled that well. "Can you take ownership of this area?" Ownership feels like recognition. Then, "We'll need you to lead this moving forward." Now your workload has expanded significantly, but it didn't happen at once. It happened incrementally. Each step felt natural. Refusing midway would feel inconsistent, and inconsistency feels uncomfortable. Relationship escalation. Incremental commitment appears in relationships too. A small compromise, then another, then another. Each one justified as minor. Over time, boundaries shift, but because the shift was gradual, it feels normal. This is how subtle imbalance forms, not through dramatic change, through slow drift. The power of micro-agreements. Even simple, verbal agreements matter. "Yes, I see your point. Maybe you are right. That makes sense." These seem harmless, but repeated micro-agreements create alignment. Alignment creates psychological obligation. The more you verbally align, the harder it becomes to oppose later. Escalation through time investment. Another incremental tactic is time investment. The more time you spend on something, the more committed you feel. This is why free trials often convert to paid subscriptions. You've already invested time. Abandoning feels like waste. Time invested equals emotional attachment. Emotional attachment increases compliance. The sunk cost trap, closely related, is the sunk cost effect. Once you've invested effort, you feel compelled to continue, even if the situation changes, even if the logic no longer supports continuation. Manipulation sometimes relies on this. It allows you to invest gradually until withdrawal feels too costly. How to recognize escalation? Ask yourself, if this was the first request, would I agree? If not, you are likely inside incremental escalation. The earlier you detect it, the easier it is to correct. Waiting makes disengagement harder. Strategic resistance. Consistency is powerful, but autonomy is more powerful. You are allowed to revise commitments. You are allowed to reassess. You are allowed to say, I agreed earlier, but this has expanded beyond what I intended. This is not inconsistency. It is clarity. Manipulation depends on your discomfort with revising decisions. Clarity dissolves that discomfort. The core insight. Small agreements build identity alignment. Identity alignment builds momentum. Momentum builds compliance. The first step is rarely dangerous, but repeated steps without reflection can lead far from your original intention. The power lies not in the final demand, but in the first yes. Awareness interrupts the chain, and interruption restores control. We have now built 7 deep layers: architecture, framing, emotional engineering, status manipulation, social proof, scarcity, incremental commitment. Next, we examine one of the most emotionally powerful tactics in everyday life: guilt, reciprocity, and obligation economics. Chapter 8. Guilt, Reciprocity, and the Economics of Obligation. Human relationships are built on exchange, not transactional exchange in a cold sense, but psychological exchange, attention for attention, support for support, kindness for kindness. This system stabilizes social cooperation, but the same system can be exploited, and when it is exploited, manipulation rarely feels like pressure. It feels like responsibility. The reciprocity reflex. One of the strongest behavioral tendencies in humans is the reciprocity reflex. When someone gives you something, you feel an urge to give something back. This instinct is deeply wired, because in early human communities, failing to reciprocate could mean social exclusion. Exclusion threatened survival, so the brain developed a bias toward repaying favors quickly. This instinct operates automatically, before logic, before evaluation, before questioning motive. When kindness becomes leverage, consider this situation. Someone helps you unexpectedly. They offer assistance without being asked. You feel gratitude. Later they request something significant. Refusing now feels uncomfortable. Why? Because the earlier favor created psychological debt. This is obligation economics. The favor was not necessarily malicious, but the timing of the request reveals intention. Manipulation through reciprocity rarely demands repayment explicitly. It relies on internal pressure. You feel compelled, not coerced. That distinction makes it powerful. The subtle construction of debt. Debt does not require money. It can be emotional. I was there for you when you needed someone. I supported you when others didn't. These reminders activate guilt. Guilt reinforces debt. Debt reinforces compliance. The person does not have to say, "You owe me." The implication is enough, and implication carries more emotional weight than direct demand. Guilt as behavioral control. Guilt is one of the strongest social regulators. It protects group cohesion, but it can also be weaponized. Statements like, "I guess I just expected more," "I didn't think you'd let me down," "after everything I've done." These phrases trigger belonging anxiety. You fear appearing selfish. You fear social withdrawal, so you comply. Not because the request is rational, but because the emotional discomfort of refusing is too high. Obligation framing in professional settings. In workplaces, obligation is often framed as loyalty. "We're counting on you. The team needs you. Don't leave us hanging." The language activates identity as a reliable contributor. Now declining feels like betrayal, even if the request exceeds reasonable boundaries. Manipulation through obligation thrives in environments where identity is tied to contribution. The power of pre-giving. In sales psychology, there is a tactic called pre-giving. Provide value first, then request action. Free samples, complimentary consultations, exclusive previews. The initial generosity activates reciprocity reflex. The later request feels balanced, not forced. even when the cost of the final action far exceeds the initial gift. Emotional ledger imbalance. Healthy relationships maintain balanced reciprocity over time. Manipulative dynamics track favors strategically. They keep an emotional ledger. They remind you of previous contributions. They resurface sacrifices during conflict. This transforms generosity into leverage, and leverage into control. When guilt overrides boundaries, the most dangerous form of obligation manipulation occurs when boundaries are eroded through guilt. You hesitate to say no. You rationalize overextension. You compromise repeatedly, not because you want to, but because you fear appearing ungrateful. Gratitude becomes entrapment. The line between kindness and coercion blurs. Real-world scenario. Personal relationship. A partner says, "I rearranged my entire schedule for you. Now a simple disagreement feels disproportionate. You feel indebted." Even if the rearrangement was voluntary, the emotional framing transforms generosity into obligation. Strategic awareness asks, was this given freely, or was it an investment expecting return? Intention matters. Real-world scenario. Workplace loyalty. A manager says, "I advocated for you when no one else did." Now any disagreement feels like disloyalty. The earlier support becomes a psychological anchor. You fear damaging the perceived alliance. But support does not require obedience. That distinction restores autonomy. The strategic counter. Reciprocity is healthy when mutual. It becomes manipulative when weaponized. Defense begins with internal clarity. Ask, was this favor given freely or with expectation? If someone reminds you repeatedly of what they've done, it may not have been generosity. It may have been positioning. Healthy reciprocity does not require reminders. It balances naturally. Emotional maturity and obligation. You are allowed to appreciate someone without surrendering autonomy. You are allowed to say, "I value what you've done, but I cannot agree to this." Gratitude does not equal compliance. Acknowledgement does not equal obedience. The manipulator relies on your discomfort with separation. Clarity dissolves that discomfort. The deeper insight. Manipulation through guilt and obligation is powerful because it feels moral. You are not being forced. You are being reminded. And reminders trigger internal pressure. But internal pressure is not obligation. It is conditioning. Understanding this creates space, and space restores choice. Chapter 9. Gaslighting and perception distortion. Manipulation becomes dangerous when it no longer tries to influence your decision. It tries to influence your memory, your interpretation, your sense of reality. Gaslighting is not simply lying. It is the systematic erosion of your confidence in your own perception, and when perception weakens, control strengthens. What gaslighting really is. Gaslighting is not disagreement. It is not perspective difference. It is repeated reality distortion designed to make you question yourself. It often sounds like, "That never happened. You are imagining things. You are too sensitive. You always exaggerate. You remember it wrong." These statements attack perception directly. If repeated consistently, they create doubt, and doubt erodes certainty. Why it works? Humans are social validators. We calibrate reality through others. If someone consistently contradicts your interpretation, you begin to question your own memory, especially if they appear confident, especially if they hold perceived status, especially if they combine denial with emotional calm. The more composed the denial, the more unstable you feel. Confidence in contradiction creates psychological imbalance. The gradual nature of distortion. Gaslighting rarely begins dramatically. It starts with minor corrections, small dismissals, subtle reframing. Over time, the narrative shifts. You begin second, guessing simple observations. You begin asking, did I overreact? Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I am too sensitive. This internal questioning is the goal, because once you doubt yourself, you seek external confirmation, and the manipulator becomes the confirmation source. Dependence forms quietly. Emotional confusion as control. Gaslighting often pairs denial with emotional framing. You are overthinking. You are being dramatic. You are projecting. Now your emotional reaction becomes the focus, not the original issue. The conversation shifts from event to your mental stability. This is structural redirection. The original problem disappears. Your response becomes the problem. This destabilizes your confidence. Workplace gaslighting. In professional settings, gaslighting can appear as, "I never said that. You misunderstood the instructions. That wasn't my intention. You are misinterpreting." Occasional miscommunication is normal, but consistent denial patterns signal distortion. If patterns repeat, it is not confusion, it is narrative control. Strategic confusion. Another tactic is ambiguity. Statements that are vague enough to deny later. We discussed adjusting timelines without specifics. Later, that's not what I meant. Ambiguity creates flexibility. Flexibility allows retroactive interpretation. This preserves the manipulator's control, because clarity would lock accountability. The psychological impact. Repeated perception distortion creates cognitive dissonance. You feel tension between your memory and the other person's assertion. To resolve tension, the brain may adjust your memory, not consciously, automatically. This is why gaslighting can be powerful. It exploits your desire for coherence. Emotional isolation. Gaslighting intensifies when combined with isolation. If you lack alternative perspectives, you rely solely on the manipulator's interpretation. Without external validation, doubt multiplies. This is why independent verification is crucial. Write events down. Seek objective input. Anchor memory and documentation when necessary. Real-world scenario. Relationship distortion. You say, "You dismissed my concern yesterday." They respond, "I was joking. You are too sensitive." Now the dismissal is reframed as humor. Your emotional reaction becomes the issue. If this pattern repeats, you begin questioning your emotional calibration. You suppress reaction next time. Suppression reduces confrontation. Confrontation reduction increases control. Real-world scenario. Professional narrative control. You present a concern. Later, it is framed as your misinterpretation. You misunderstood the scope. If this happens repeatedly, you hesitate to speak. Self-doubt lowers perceived authority. Lower authority increases susceptibility. Defense against gaslighting. The defense is not emotional escalation, it is structural grounding. 1. Document events objectively. 2. Reconfirm details in writing when necessary. 3. Avoid arguing over emotional framing. 4. Separate fact from interpretation. When someone denies reality, stay calm. State facts without escalation. On Tuesday at 3 p.m. this was discussed. Clarity resists distortion. The strategic insight. Gaslighting works by attacking certainty, and certainty anchors autonomy. When you trust your perception, you act decisively. When you doubt your perception, you hesitate. Hesitation creates vulnerability. The manipulator does not need to overpower you. They only need to destabilize you. But once you understand the tactic, you recognize patterns, and recognition restores stability. Chapter 10. Silence as psychological leverage. Most people fear silence. They interpret it as awkward, uncomfortable, threatening, so they rush to fill it. And in rushing, they reveal, they concede, they over-explain, they soften their position. Silence is powerful because it activates discomfort, and discomfort triggers reaction. The person who tolerates silence controls pace, and the one who controls pace often controls outcome. Why silence creates pressure. Human communication is rhythmic. Statement, response, statement, response. When that rhythm breaks, the nervous system notices. If someone makes a proposal and the other person says nothing, anxiety rises. The mind begins searching. Did I say something wrong? Is this rejected? Are they judging me? To relieve discomfort, the speaking party often adds more. They justify. They negotiate against themselves. They reveal hidden concerns. Silence extracts information without asking a question. Silence in negotiation. Imagine you present a price. You stop speaking. The other person remains silent. Seconds pass. Your internal tension rises. You may feel compelled to say, "We could adjust slightly. There might be flexibility. I understand budgets are tight." The silence did not argue. It waited. And your discomfort created movement. Experienced negotiators understand this deeply. They speak, they stop, they wait. The first person to break silence often weakens position. Emotional interpretation of silence. Silence can be interpreted in many ways. Disapproval, confidence, patience, contemplation. The ambiguity increases its power because the other person fills the gap with projection. If someone already feels uncertain, they interpret silence as judgment. If someone feels insecure, They interpret silence as rejection. Silence amplifies the internal state of the other person. This makes it a mirror, and mirrors reveal vulnerability. Silence as status signal. High-status individuals are rarely rushed. They do not speak to fill space. They respond when ready. Calm silence communicates, "I am not pressured." That alone signals dominance. When you answer immediately, you appear reactive. When you pause before responding, you appear deliberate. Deliberation implies authority. Authority implies control. Strategic pause versus awkward silence. There is a difference between uncomfortable silence and controlled pause. Controlled pause has structure. You listen, you breathe, you consider, you respond. It is intentional. Uncomfortable silence is nervous. It seeks escape. Strategic individuals train themselves to tolerate pause because they understand that the one who reacts first often loses leverage. Silence in conflict. In arguments, silence can de-escalate or destabilize. If someone raises their voice and you remain calm and quiet, the contrast becomes visible. The louder party appears less composed. The silent party appears stable. Stability shifts perceived hierarchy, but silence must not be passive avoidance. It must be composed presence. Otherwise, it signals withdrawal. Real-world scenario: workplace. A colleague challenges your proposal aggressively. Instead of responding instantly, you pause. You hold eye contact. You let the words settle. The room shifts. Others observe your composure. Your response, when it comes, feels more controlled. The pause reframes the dynamic. Without speaking, you signaled confidence. Real-world scenario. Personal interaction. Someone attempts emotional manipulation. You clearly don't care. Instead of defending immediately, you pause. You let the statement sit. Often, the manipulator fills the silence. They soften. They justify. They retreat slightly. Silence exposes exaggeration. Why silence feels uncomfortable? Because humans are social validation seekers. We want immediate feedback. When silence appears, validation is withheld. Uncertainty increases. Most people rush to resolve uncertainty. Manipulators sometimes weaponize silence intentionally. Strategic individuals use silence responsibly. The difference lies in intent and control. Defensive use of silence. Silence is also protection. When emotionally triggered, pause. Before responding, breathe. Emotional manipulation depends on reaction speed. Delay interrupts escalation. Clarity re-enters. Silence buys time. Time restores control. The strategic insight. Silence is not emptiness. It is space. And space reveals structure. When you stop filling space automatically, you begin observing more. You notice body language, tone shifts, emotional cues. You gather information. Information equals leverage. The one who tolerates silence is rarely the one pressured. They are often the one observing, and the observer sees more than the speaker. Chapter 11. Strategic charm and artificial warmth. Most people defend against aggression. They do not defend against kindness. That is why charm can be more powerful than dominance. Because charm lowers guard, and lowered guard increases influence. Why likability matters. Human beings are wired to cooperate with those they like. We assign positive traits to warm individuals automatically. If someone smiles, maintains open body language, uses your name, mirrors your posture subtly, you feel rapport. Rapport creates trust. Trust reduces skepticism. Reduced skepticism increases compliance. This process is fast, often unconscious. The halo effect. When someone appears charismatic, confident, well-dressed, socially fluent, we assume competence in unrelated areas. This is the halo effect. Attractive or charming individuals are perceived as more intelligent, more capable, more trustworthy, even without evidence. Manipulators understand this bias. They amplify surface warmth to bypass analytical scrutiny. Mirroring and behavioral alignment. One of the most subtle charm techniques is mirroring. Matching tone, matching pace, matching posture, matching emotional energy. When someone mirrors you subtly, you feel understood. Understanding feels safe. Safety increases openness. But mirroring is not always natural empathy. It can be calculated alignment. The more aligned someone appears, the less likely you are to question them. Compliments as influence softening. Compliments lower resistance. You are very perceptive. I admire your thinking. You have strong instincts. These statements elevate identity. Once identity is elevated, you feel motivated to act consistently with it. If someone praises your decisiveness, you may make faster decisions to reinforce that identity. The compliment becomes a behavioral cue. Artificial vulnerability. Another tactic is controlled vulnerability, sharing personal struggles strategically, revealing selective weakness, displaying emotion deliberately. This creates intimacy quickly. Intimacy accelerates trust, but true vulnerability builds gradually. Artificial vulnerability is calibrated. It reveals enough to connect, but not enough to weaken position. The goal is emotional bonding. Bonding reduces defense over familiarity. Manipulators sometimes create rapid familiarity, using first names immediately, sharing inside jokes quickly, reducing formality early. This collapses social distance. Collapsed distance feels comfortable. Comfort increases openness, but accelerated closeness can bypass natural trust-building timelines. When trust forms too quickly, critical thinking weakens. Real-world scenario. Sales interaction. A salesperson mirrors your communication style. They mention similar interests. They compliment your choices. They laugh at your comments. You feel rapport. When the offer is introduced, it feels less transactional, more collaborative. Your resistance lowers because you no longer feel sold to. You feel understood. Real-world scenario. Workplace influence. A colleague builds alliance before requesting support. They praise your previous work. They highlight shared goals. They create emotional alignment. By the time they ask for backing, you feel connected. Connection becomes commitment. The psychology behind it. Humans are social creatures. We prefer alignment over conflict. When someone appears warm, we assume benign intent. This assumption can be exploited. Charm bypasses logic because it feels relational. But warmth does not guarantee integrity. The danger of charismatic authority. Charismatic individuals often gather influence quickly because confidence plus warmth creates powerful presence. But presence is not proof. Many persuasive leaders throughout history used charm to gain trust before revealing true intention. Charisma amplifies influence. It does not validate character. Defense against artificial warmth. Slow down emotional bonding. Ask, is this connection earned through time or accelerated deliberately? Separate personality from proposal. Evaluate ideas independently of delivery. Warm delivery does not guarantee strong reasoning. Maintain composure even in friendly environments. Likability should not override clarity. Authentic charm versus manipulative charm. Authentic charm is not strategic. It is consistent. It does not shift based on objective. It does not intensify before requests. Manipulative charm increases when compliance is needed. Notice timing. If warmth spikes before demands, be alert. Patterns reveal intention. The strategic insight. Aggression triggers defense. Charm disarms defense. The most effective manipulation is rarely loud. It is friendly. It smiles. It aligns. It connects. And then it persuades. Understanding charm as a psychological lever does not require becoming cynical. It requires becoming observant, because warmth without scrutiny can lead to misplaced trust, and misplaced trust is costly. Chapter 12. Authority signals and hierarchy exploitation. Human beings are hierarchy sensitive. We constantly scan for who leads, who decides, who commands, who approves. This sensitivity developed for survival in early human groups. Following competent authority increased safety, but the same instinct can be exploited because perceived authority often overrides critical thought. The obedience bias. Research in behavioral psychology has repeatedly demonstrated that people comply with authority even when uncomfortable. Uniforms increase obedience. Formal titles increase compliance. Structured environments increase alignment. Authority does not need to shout. It needs to be signaled. And signals are everywhere. Visible authority cues. Authority is often communicated through symbols, formal clothing, professional titles, credentials, office location, confident posture, controlled tone, minimal hesitation. If someone says, "As the director," authority is established before argument begins. The brain shortcuts analysis. Director implies competence, and competence implies correctness. This is cognitive efficiency. But efficiency is not accuracy. The power of institutional backing. When influence is paired with institution, it strengthens. This is company policy, this is government regulation, this is backed by research. Institutional framing reduces personal responsibility. If the rule comes from above, disobedience feels risky, even if the authority is distant. Institution plus hierarchy equals psychological weight. Authority and moral framing. Authority is strongest when paired with moral language. This is the right thing to do. This is what responsible people choose. This is the professional standard. Now disagreement feels unethical, not just different. Moral framing amplifies authority, because humans seek social approval and fear moral rejection. False authority construction. Some individuals create artificial authority using complex language, citing vague research, referencing unnamed experts, displaying symbolic markers of credibility. The more confident the delivery, the more convincing the authority appears. But confidence is not evidence, and titles are not guarantees of truth. The untrained mind equates authority with accuracy. The trained mind separates the two. Real-world scenario. Workplace hierarchy. A senior executive states, "This is how we're moving forward." Silence follows. Even if doubts exist, hierarchy suppresses dissent. The higher the perceived authority, the lower the resistance, unless someone consciously evaluates content separately from position. But that requires psychological awareness. Real-world scenario. Medical authority. If a doctor recommends a treatment, most patients accept without deep evaluation, not because they verified data, but because authority signals competence. This is often appropriate. But blind obedience can also suppress necessary questioning. Healthy authority invites scrutiny. Manipulative authority discourages it. Authority through certainty. Certainty itself signals hierarchy. Statements delivered without hesitation appear more credible. If someone says, "This is what we're doing," with stable tone, no filler words, no uncertainty, the brain interprets decisiveness as strength. But decisiveness does not equal correctness. It equals confidence, and confidence persuades. Defense against authority exploitation. When authority appears, pause, ask, is the authority relevant? Is it qualified in this domain? Is evidence present? Is dissent allowed? Authority that resists questioning is often insecure. True expertise withstands scrutiny. False authority demands obedience. Psychological separation. The most important defense is separation. Separate position from argument, tone from evidence, title from truth. When you detach structure from content, authority loses automatic control. You evaluate substance independently, and that restores autonomy. The strategic insight. Authority is powerful because it simplifies complexity. If someone higher in hierarchy approves, you feel safe aligning. But safety and correctness are not identical. Manipulation through authority works best when unquestioned. Clarity requires respectful scrutiny. You can respect hierarchy without surrendering reasoning. You can acknowledge expertise without abandoning evaluation. That balance defines psychological maturity. Chapter 13. Cognitive bias exploitation. How mental shortcuts are used against you. Your brain is not designed for perfect logic. It is designed for efficiency. It makes predictions quickly. It fills gaps automatically. It simplifies complexity. These shortcuts are called cognitive biases. They are not flaws. They are survival adaptations. But when someone understands them, they can be leveraged strategically. The confirmation bias. The mind seeks agreement. Once you form a belief, you naturally search for evidence that confirms it, and you subconsciously ignore evidence that challenges it. Manipulators do not always try to change your belief directly. They feed it. If someone knows your political leaning, they present selective data reinforcing it. If someone knows your insecurity, they reinforce narratives supporting it. Agreement builds trust. Trust lowers defense. The manipulation is not in contradiction, it is in reinforcement. The anchoring effect. The first number introduced in a negotiation influences perception. The first idea introduced in a debate frames expectations. This is anchoring. If someone says, "This normally costs $1,000, but today it's $600," your brain compares to $1,000, not intrinsic value. The initial anchor defines the range. Even if the anchor was arbitrary, the first price in a negotiation often shapes the final outcome, because the brain adjusts from the anchor, not from zero. The availability heuristic. The brain estimates probability based on recall. If something is vivid, recent, or emotionally charged, It feels more common. Manipulators use dramatic examples, extreme cases, emotional stories, even if statistically rare, because vivid memory outweighs data. A single intense story can overshadow multiple moderate realities. Emotion increases recall. Recall increases perceived truth, the authority bias. When someone appears credible, you assign their statements higher accuracy, even without verification. Credentials, confidence, status. These cues shortcut evaluation. You do not analyze deeply, you assume reliability. This bias saves time, but it creates vulnerability, especially when authority is simulated. The reciprocity bias. We discussed obligation earlier, but reciprocity also functions cognitively. If someone makes a concession, you feel compelled to reciprocate. In negotiation, someone might say, "We can reduce the price slightly." Now you feel compelled to concede something in return, even if the concession was planned. Small sacrifices generate compliance, because fairness instinct activates automatically. The consistency bias. Once you state a position publicly, you feel compelled to defend it, even if new information appears. Manipulators sometimes extract early commitments. Do you agree this is important? You say yes. Later, then you should support this solution. You already aligned with the premise. To disagree feels inconsistent. Consistency feels virtuous, but it can trap reasoning. The scarcity bias. We explored scarcity emotionally, but cognitively, scarcity increases perceived value. Limited items appear more desirable. Exclusive access appears more prestigious. The mind equates rarity with importance. Even when rarity is artificial, this is not logical. It is psychological. The framing effect. The way information is presented changes perception. 90% survival rate versus 10% mortality rate. Identical data, different emotional response. Positive framing increases acceptance. Negative framing increases caution. The structure of presentation shapes evaluation. The sunk cost fallacy. Once you invest time, money, or energy, you feel compelled to continue, even if future benefit declines. Manipulators sometimes allow you to invest gradually, so disengagement feels like loss. Loss feels painful, so you persist, not because it is optimal, but because stopping feels wasteful. Pattern exploitation. Biases do not operate in isolation, they stack. Imagine this combination. Authority presents a scarce opportunity, supported by social proof, framed positively, with an early small commitment. Resistance becomes unlikely, because multiple cognitive shortcuts align simultaneously. This is advanced influence architecture, real-world scenario, media narrative. A news segment highlights one extreme incident. It repeats dramatic footage. It frames urgency. It cites authority. Even if statistically rare, the availability heuristic amplifies perceived risk. Public reaction shifts, not because of complete data, but because of cognitive shortcut activation. Real-world scenario, workplace pitch. A proposal is introduced with, "Industry leaders are adopting this." It's a limited opportunity. It positions us ahead of competitors. Authority, scarcity, social proof. The architecture is layered. Evaluation becomes compressed. Acceptance increases. Defense through metacognition. The strongest defense against cognitive bias exploitation is metacognition, thinking about your thinking. When emotion spikes, ask why. When urgency appears, ask whether it is real. When authority speaks, separate title from argument. When popularity is cited, ask for data. Bias cannot be removed, but it can be noticed, and noticing interrupts automatic compliance. The strategic insight. Manipulation at its deepest level is not about control over others. It is about understanding the human operating system. Biases are built in programs. When someone understands the code, they can predict behavior. But when you understand the code, you regain autonomy. You slow down, you question structure, you examine framing, you detach from emotional acceleration. And in that pause, power shifts back to you. Chapter 14. Psychological immunity. Building resistance without becoming cynical. When people first begin studying manipulation, they often swing too far. They start seeing tactics everywhere. They mistrust everyone. They become guarded. But that is not psychological strength. That is reaction. True psychological immunity does not make you cold. It makes you clear. Awareness without hypervigilance. There is a difference between awareness and suspicion. Suspicion assumes hostile intent. Awareness observes structure. If someone frames something positively, you do not assume deception. You simply notice framing. If someone uses urgency, you do not panic. You evaluate necessity. Immunity is not aggression. It is stability. The pause principle. The first layer of psychological immunity is the pause. Manipulation thrives in speed. Speed bypasses analysis. When you pause, you create cognitive distance. Distance allows evaluation. Before agreeing, pause. Before reacting emotionally, pause. Before defending reflexively, pause. That small delay interrupts automatic compliance. Emotional regulation as shield. Emotional engineering works only when emotion drives behavior. If you can regulate your internal state, external influence weakens. When guilt appears, observe it. When urgency appears, observe it. When flattery appears, observe it. Observation reduces intensity. Intensity reduction restores reasoning. The goal is not emotional suppression. It is emotional literacy, recognizing emotional shifts in real time. Clarifying questions. Manipulation relies on assumption. Questions dissolve assumption. When someone says, everyone agrees, you ask, who specifically? When someone says, we must act now, you ask, what happens if we wait? When someone says, you misunderstood, you ask, let's clarify the details. Questions restore structure. Structure reduces distortion, separating intent from impact. Not all influence is malicious. Sometimes people use tactics unconsciously. Instead of labeling immediately, evaluate pattern. Is the behavior repeated? Is it strategic? Is it selective? Pattern recognition is more reliable than emotional reaction. Immunity is analytical, not accusatory, building internal authority. External authority loses power when internal authority strengthens. If you trust your reasoning, status intimidation weakens. If you trust your perception, gaslighting fails. If you trust your boundaries, guilt manipulation softens. Internal authority comes from clear values, defined limits, consistent self-reflection. When you know where you stand, external pressure shifts less. Boundary precision. Boundaries must be explicit internally before they are communicated externally. If you do not define your limits, incremental commitment erodes them. Immunity requires knowing what you will accept, what you will negotiate, what you will refuse. Clarity prevents drift. Drift creates vulnerability, slowing commitment momentum. When escalation begins, reset scale. Instead of continuing, pause and reassess. If this were the first request, would I agree? If the answer is no, adjust accordingly. Momentum is powerful. Interrupting it restores autonomy. Documentation and external validation. In environments where distortion occurs, documentation protects clarity. Written confirmation, summarized agreements, clear timelines. This is not mistrust. It is structural transparency. External verification strengthens perception confidence, especially in hierarchical settings. Emotional detachment from validation. Many manipulation tactics rely on your desire for approval, charm, status, consensus, guilt. When validation matters too much, influence deepens. If you detach from constant approval seeking, you become less susceptible. This does not mean becoming indifferent. It means not outsourcing your self-worth. Resisting identity imposition. If someone labels you, you are the reliable one, you are too emotional, you are aggressive. Pause before internalizing. Ask, is this accurate or convenient? Identity frames are powerful, but they are not permanent unless accepted. Calm as countermeasure. Manipulation escalates emotion. Immunity stabilizes emotion. When someone accelerates pressure, you decelerate response. When someone raises intensity, you lower tone. Contrast destabilizes manipulative rhythm. Calm is disruptive to manipulation, avoiding overcorrection. Psychological immunity must not become social isolation. Not every compliment is manipulation. Not every urgency is deception. Not every authority is corrupt. Discernment requires nuance. Overcorrection creates rigidity. Rigidity reduces adaptability. Immunity is flexible awareness, not defensive hostility. The strategic insight. The goal is not to become impossible to influence. Influence is part of cooperation. The goal is to choose influence consciously. When you can detect framing, recognize emotional activation, identify status signals, notice scarcity tactics, and pause before commitment. You regain authorship of your decisions. You are no longer reacting, you are evaluating. And evaluation is power. We now move into the final integrative layer, not just how manipulation works, not just how to defend, but the ethical boundary, where influence ends and manipulation begins. Chapter 15. Ethical influence versus manipulation, where the line is drawn. Influence itself is not immoral, it is unavoidable. Every conversation influences, every tone shift influences, every framing choice influences. The difference between influence and manipulation is not technique, it is intent and transparency. Influence is structural. You cannot communicate without framing. You cannot persuade without emotional activation. You cannot lead without authority signals. Influence is embedded in interaction, but influence becomes manipulation when it removes informed choice. That is the line. The core distinction. Ethical influence presents information clearly, allows scrutiny, respects autonomy, accepts disagreement, does not distort perception. Manipulation conceals intent, engineers emotional pressure, distorts context, suppresses dissent, exploits cognitive bias intentionally. The mechanics may look similar, the motive separates them. Transparency as anchor. Influence becomes ethical when the other party retains clarity. If you frame something positively, but allow questions, that is persuasion. If you frame something selectively and discourage scrutiny, that is manipulation. Transparency preserves agency. Opacity removes it. The role of emotional activation. Emotion is not unethical, but deliberate emotional destabilization for compliance is, for example, inspiring urgency for a legitimate safety concern, is responsible influence. Manufacturing urgency for artificial scarcity is manipulation. Intent and accuracy determine integrity. Authority with accountability. Authority is not manipulation. Leadership requires direction. But ethical authority allows challenge. It does not silence opposition. It does not distort dissent into disloyalty. True authority strengthens when questioned. False authority resists examination, using psychology without exploiting it. Once you understand these mechanisms, you gain strategic advantage. You can frame ideas clearly, maintain calm under pressure, recognize bias, communicate with structure, but you must choose restraint, because influence without restraint erodes trust. And trust is long-term power. Manipulation may win short-term outcomes, but it weakens long-term credibility. The paradox of power. The more psychologically aware you become, the more influence you possess. But the strongest individuals do not use influence to dominate. They use it to clarify. They use it to stabilize. They use it to build cooperation. The difference lies in intention. Control seeks advantage at others' expense. Influence seeks alignment without deception. Real-world application. In negotiation, you can use framing ethically by presenting full context. In leadership, you can use authority responsibly by inviting dissent. In relationships, you can use emotional intelligence without weaponizing guilt. Understanding the mechanics does not demand exploitation. It demands maturity, psychological responsibility. Once you see the structure, you cannot unsee it. You will notice framing in media, emotional activation in advertising, scarcity in marketing, authority signals in politics, charm in persuasion. The question becomes, will you use this awareness to control others, or to protect clarity? True strength is not exploitation, it is restraint, the final integration. We began with invisible architecture. We explored framing, emotion, status, social proof, scarcity, commitment, guilt, gaslighting, silence, charm, authority, bias, exploitation, immunity. All of these are tools. Tools can build, tools can destroy. The difference is discipline. Conclusion. Clarity is power. Manipulation is not rare. It is woven into daily life. It shapes meetings, relationships, media narratives, negotiations, leadership structures. But once you understand it, it loses invisibility, and invisibility is its greatest strength. You do not need to fear influence. You need to recognize it. Pause before reacting. Examine framing. Regulate emotion. separate authority from argument, slow urgency, clarify assumptions. That is psychological strength. The strongest individuals are not the most aggressive, they are the most aware, because awareness restores choice, and choice is power. Power rarely announces itself, it operates quietly, in tone, in framing, in silence, in timing. Most people move through conversations reacting. Few understand the structure beneath them, and fewer still pause long enough to see it. You now understand the mechanics, not to dominate, not to manipulate blindly, but to recognize, to evaluate, to choose consciously, because the person who understands influence cannot be easily controlled by it. Clarity is not loud, it is stable, and stability is power. This has been the psychology of manipulation, the hidden tactics people use daily. A strategic psychology audiobook from Audiobook Mantra. If this deepened your understanding of human behavior, consider subscribing. We are building a library of psychological clarity, one structure at a time. Until the next listen, stay observant, stay composed, and stay aware.